Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written a tremendous new book explaining Iran's political history over the past half century. Vali, thank you so much for being our guest on Books in Five. Please tell us your full name, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this program. My name is Vali Nasr. I'm a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C., where I'm joining you from. And my book is called Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. The underlying message of your book highlights the misunderstanding that American policymakers have towards Iran. Tell us more about the motivations to explore this topic and the sources that you used.
Iran has become a very important or challenging foreign policy issue for the United States and the West as a whole. But I think the understanding about why has Iran adopted the strategies that it has done and why is it positioned itself against the United States is not quite understood. It's usually attributed to ideology, to religion, to sort of an instinctive anti-Americanism. But my argument is that there is a strategic outlook here, which is not drawn from religion, but is drawn from history. Iran's suspicions about the outside, America's intentions towards Iran. And also in the recent years, there has been tremendous amount of archival material, memoirs, oral histories, interviews, and the like that have become available inside Iran. And there's obviously a very open public debate among academics and intellectuals about Iran's foreign policy, which is largely unknown in the West. So I brought all of these into the book to outline why does this country think the way it does on foreign policy, on America, on Europe, and what are the strategies that it has adopted to get there? In other words, what's the logic behind what we see Iran doing?
Let's dive a little bit more into the conversations that you had with important decision makers in Iran. What was your intention and what was the results of speaking with those important leaders?
I mean, I think in world affairs, whether you're an ally or an adversary of a country, you have to take its thinking seriously. And just saying that they're ideological or the religion or the religious text gets them to do something misses the point. If you're going to organize yourself against them, change their behavior, you have to understand how are they playing chess? What are their assumptions? What are the calculations? What are they trying to get out of it? What are they trying to prevent and what are they trying to gain? And in my conversations, as well as what I've read and analyzed, my aim has to be to tease out all of these about Iran's leadership. It's not an approval or a disapproval. I've tried to remain neutral rather than to put all of this on the table. Iran is an adversary of the United States, of many European countries, be that right or wrong. The United States and the European countries have to understand Iran, have to understand what are they dealing with, how is the other side looking at the chessboard.
We have about 2 more minutes for this question. And from what I read in the book, you spend a lot of time overturning myths. Can you discuss that a little bit more about some of the myths that you have revealed as being untrue?
Well, I think the greatest myth is that Iran is driven by religion. And there's something in Islamic religion, Iran's interpretation of Islam, that makes it be anti-American, that this is really a cultural war. And this actually has resonance with the way that the West interpreted 9/11, the global war on terror, the entire Islamophobia decades that we went through. And I think this is misplaced. Iran, like China, like India, has a history with imperialism, with colonialism. It has gone through 2 centuries of almost being disintegrated. It believes that foreign powers mean ill for Iran and that the United States has interfered in Iran. And the revolution from 1979, the moment that it came, it believed that its greatest achievement was not to bring Islam to Iran, but was to make Iran independent. In fact, Islam was the tool that gave Iran independence. And since then, it has been trying to protect that independence. Now, this might be foolhardy, maybe misplaced, but it's actually a secular historical reason that many countries in the developing South could instinctively understand, even if they don't share Iran's tactics or strategies, they understand the logic behind it.
Let's move on to our second question. You set the stage with a chapter titled Loom of History that details the importance of Iran's experience before 1979. What took place in this period, and how does it inform Iranians in the present day?
Well, Iranians are acutely aware of the weight of history, of the fact that in the 19th century, Iran was almost torn apart between Russia and Britain. Britain never directly colonized India as they did, colonized Iran as they did India, but it basically subjected to intense amount of penetration of imperialism. And that is still very much in Iran's psyche. During World War II, Iran was occupied by Allied powers. Its government, its king was removed from office. The Soviet Union occupied parts of Iran, didn't want to leave. And then the revolutionary leadership believed that the government of Shah in Iran was brought to power by an American coup, although that's not quite historically accurate, but that's the belief that they had. And that at least until 1979, Iran was under the thumb of the United States. And so the Iranian revolution in its own self-conception has basically fought against the legacy of this history, of Iran having been weak under the thumb of the West. And the revolution, as I mentioned, sees one of its greatest achievements to make Iran independent. And this is in the pronouncements of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, is in the pronouncements of Iran's leaders. I mean, even just last week, former Iranian foreign minister said that the Islamic Republic is the first country in the first government in Iran in the past 225 years to give Iran genuine independence. Now, we may, as historians, take issue with that, but it tells us that what is driving the Islamic Republic is not fulfilling some religious destiny. It is about their conception that their contribution to Iranian history is this issue of giving Iran independence.
Another aspect of that chapter that I learned about was the fight against autocracy. Can you talk a little bit more about the Iranian self-conception of fighting against dictators?
Well, this has been an ongoing theme throughout the 20th century and now the 21st century. Even as we are speaking, Iranians are unhappy with authoritarianism in Iran, with lack of democratic rights, free speech, etc. That was also true of the Pahlavi period, when the Pahlavi monarchs were modernizing autocrats, which is a typical theme in the global South. Many countries have gone through that. So they saw the fight, the political fight in Iran throughout the most of the 20th century until the Iranian Revolution was democracy against autocracy. But this was also entwined with this belief that this autocracy that was there was facilitated by the United States, was backed by the United States, and therefore the United States was interfering in Iran's domestic affairs through that autocracy. So the revolution mixed this fight against autocracy with this fight against Iran's independence. And in this struggle, the United States basically was the protagonist, because the United States was the chief imperialist power that was behind both the autocracy and denying Iran its independence. And I would say finally that a lot of Iran's leadership, including the current supreme leader in Iran, were greatly impressed with the discourse of the new left and the anti-imperialist forces across the global South and in Europe. And that mood of anti-imperialism of the post-Vietnam era was very, very influential on them. I mean, the current supreme leader in Iran is very well versed in the works of Frantz Fanon and the anti-imperialism of the 1960s and 70s. And so that was, and that anti-imperialism of the 1960s and 70s was acutely anti-American.
We have about 90 more seconds for this question. Can you talk about the impact of Mohammad Mossadegh?
Well, Mossadegh was seen as somebody in the 1950s stood for nationalizing Iran's resources in a fight against imperialism. And then he was overthrown in a coup, which many Iranians came to believe was orchestrated by the United States. I argue in the book that that's not true. The United States supported it, but there was sufficient amount of anti-Mossadegh feeling in Iran's military and among Iran's elite because they thought, as correct as he was to demand Iran's national rights, he was also going up against the West at a time that Iran needed the West in order to counter the Soviet Union, which only a decade earlier had eaten up Iran's territories. In other words, Iran very much was in the mood then, at least some of them were, that Ukraine is today, that the threat is not England or the United States, the threat is the Soviet Union, whereas Mossadegh was really a genuine anti-imperialist. And in fact, the echo of Mossadegh's struggle is still resonating in Iran today. In many ways, the Islamic Republic intellectually is era the Mossadegh movement.
Let's move on to our third question. The 1980s is the foundation for the current regime, as it was birthed and forged in the crucible of overthrowing the Shah and the war with Iraq. Walk us through the defining events of this decade and the shadow it casts into the present day.
So even though, as I described, there is this sort of a macro level view of history that informed the attitude of the Islamic Republic, many of their approach to statecraft was shaped in practice. So not long, in other words, a year after the revolution took over, and many of these revolutionary leaders are still inexperienced and have not had much time in government, Iraq invades Iran. And this is one of the most costly wars of the 20th century, even though not much attention is paid to it. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians die. The war takes 8 years, and Iran is completely isolated. The international community supports Iraq, Europe, United States, Arab countries, the United Nations. Nobody sells Iran's weapons, and Iran survives through that ordeal essentially by itself. And the lesson that it teaches Iran's leaders, among them Iran's supreme leader, the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, who then were young fighters, was that Iran was alone. International law doesn't protect it. The world is against it. It's against this regime, and it basically has to protect itself on its own. And the security mindset in Iran, and even the way they organized for war, the way they decided, well, nobody gives us an air force, so we should invest in proxies, we should invest in guerrilla warfare, etc. They all come out of that experience of the 1980s. And in a way, if I may just conclude, is as Charles Tilly, the famous sociology, once said, that wars make states and then states make war. And so the Islamic Republic is in effect really the product of the Iran-Iraq war.
Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of the hostage crisis?
Right. The hostage crisis, was a series of, if you want, unfortunate events that ended up into an international imbroglio that had a tremendous impact on the United States, but it also had a tremendous impact on Iran. First of all, the hostage crisis's benefit to Ayatollah Khomeini was that to basically force the United States to leave Iran, because the revolution in its first months lived under the fear that the United States would support another coup in Iran like it had done in 1953. And that if it didn't have an embassy in Iran, then it can't stage a coup. And so the takeover of the embassy was led by this suspicion that the United States is up to no good. But once Iran took the hostages, it witnessed the United States that was incapable of doing anything. That the United States to it looked much more like a paper tiger. There was no war on Iran. There was no military attack on Iran, etc. And in the meantime, it allowed the regime in Iran, the Islamic Republic, to create a frenzy among the Iranian public by every day having these demonstrations, saying that we're defending the country. Look, we got rid of the United States. We're protecting Iran. And that basically became embedded, if you would, for a very long period in the psyche of the Iranians, this anti-Americanism, but also imbued the Islamic Republic with this degree of frenzied anti-Americanism from which it then couldn't back away, and it became entrenched in it, and in turn also elicited a reaction from the United States, which fed this further.
We have about 90 more seconds with this question. Can you define for us the term sacred defense?
But the term sacred defense comes out of the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, once the war ended, during the war, it was called the imposed war. But when the war ended, the Islamic Republic realized that the reason that it had survived this war, again, in which Iraq was supported by Arab countries, by Europe, by the United States, etc., was because Iran had the total support of its population that was willing to sacrifice for it. And so the concept of sacred defense really captures this idea that the Islamic Republic can confront adversaries, can protect Iran's independence if it has strategic depth among the population. And that the concept of sacred defense really means a country in which the population and the government is willing to engage in a total war and dedicate all resources of the country to that effort. And that was the sort of the ideal period for the Islamic Republic. So in a way, the Iran-Iraq war it became for a very long period of time a model that they wanted to replicate.
Let's move on to our fourth question. You write about the evolution of the IRGC as it now acts as a state in itself. What role has this institution played since the end of the Cold War, both inside the nation and out?
So the IRGC is really the product of the Iran-Iraq war, because very quickly Iran realized that it could not fight Iraq or liberate its territory from Iraq if it relied on the traditional Iranian military, which had been trained in classical warfare and used classical war-making tactics, and it needed tanks, aircraft, artillery, all the material that the rest of the world would not sell Iran. And during the war, they stumbled upon these group of young, vigilante, ideologically motivated volunteers who would organize into guerrilla units, and they proved extremely effective on the battlefield. They were willing to give large numbers of dead, do daredevil attacks, and they ultimately were successful in forcing Iraq to leave Iranian territory. And out of this experience during the 8 years of war, the IRGC was born, if you would, as a completely new form of military in Iran. Now, over the years, it has grown in power. It has become the Praetorian Guard of the Islamic Republic. It now has intelligence units, missile units, all of those things. But at the same time, like militaries in Pakistan or Egypt or parts of Africa, under the guise of defending the country, it has begun to penetrate into politics and into economics, control vast areas of the economy, particularly because Iran's economy is under draconian sanctions. And that pushes the regular economy underground. When you push an economy underground in terms of trade, usually that becomes the domain of men with guns, because then you're in a very different area. So the IRGCs hold over what comes into Iran, what leaves Iran, over various sectors that it sees as national security sectors, telecommunication, manufacturing, etc., has grown vastly. So over the past 40 years, a band of volunteers during the war has coalesced into a powerful military machine with tremendous amount of influence over the country's economy and politics.
What role does the IRGC play in stomping out internal dissent?
Well, initially it did a lot more, but after 2009, it decided that at least the formal IRGC should not be in the business of suppression. So other units were created. For instance, there are vigilante units that are tied to IRGC called the Basij, which are deployed on the streets. And then there is now, for instance, in the protests that happened in Iran for hijab 2 years ago, actually police forces, obviously trained much more in varieties of crowd control ways, were deployed. The formal IRGC is now much more clearly, in terms of its military might, focused on national defense, and it's only deployed if there is a threat of let's say, a military incursion from the borders, etc. Its role in domestic suppression is now much more subtle. It's through the arm of intelligence or control of the economy or influencing politics, parliament, etc. But on the streets, when you have protests in Tehran or in Isfahan, it's not usually IRGC that's deployed anymore. It is these other military units that are deployed.
We have about 90 more seconds. Who was Qasem Soleimani?
So Qasem Soleimani was a very senior IRGC commander. I mean, at age 17, he led one of these young volunteer brigades of IRGC that I mentioned in a very heinous battle to recapture Iran's port of Khorramshahr from Iraq. And then he went up through the ranks of IRGC. And then just before the United States invaded Iraq, he was appointed by the supreme leader to organize a unit of the IRGC that would be dedicated in replicating the IRGC model during the Iran-Iraq war in the Arab world. Already Iran had experience setting up Hezbollah. So Soleimani proved to be extremely capable in organizing Shia militias in Iraq that would confound American occupation after 2003. And then in American, European, and Iranian minds, he would find legendary importance. And again, he would play a very pivotal role in defending Bashar Assad's regime in Syria, and in particular in defeating ISIS in Iraq and in Syria in collaboration with the Iraqi army, at times indirectly with the US in Iraq and with the Russians in Syria. And then eventually the Trump administration decides to kill him because it views him as a sort of the mastermind of Iran's regional capabilities. And that leads to a major deterioration of relations between Iran and the US. So now in Iran, at least with the supporters of the Islamic Republic, he has found a kind of a legendary status as a representative of what IRGC stands for.
Let's finish with our fifth question. The book concludes with an exploration of the critical issues at hand for Iran, resisting America and the nuclear program. Give us your assessment of Iran's grand strategy as it relates to this topic.
So as we're speaking, Iran has had a confrontation with Israel, with the United States. It's gone through a 12-day war. When I finished writing the book, none of this had happened. But it was very clear that this strategy that Iran has followed since 1979 had reached basically its limits. It had isolated the country, put it under tremendous sanctions. Yes, it had succeeded here and there in pushing the US out of Iraq or protecting Iran, but at a very, very high cost to the country economically. And that increasingly a new generation of Iranians that were born after Iran-Iraq war, after the revolution, no longer saw eye to eye with the ruling order about why is it that Iran has to pursue a strategy that demands independence from the United States in such a manner and with such costly tactics. And then that puts the question of sacred defense on its head. If the idea of sacred defense was that Iran was successful in the 80s because it had the support of its population, the question becomes, can its strategy be successful if the population has tired of this unending resistance? And so I think Iran still is within the grand strategy that I describe in the book, but it's very clear that grand strategy is really open to serious questions in terms of, is it viable, is it effective, and could Iran sustain it going forward? So the book also problematizes these issues, and I discuss the debates around it in Iran, which has only intensified since the confrontation with Israel.
Can you give us a brief timeline of what happened with the JCPOA?
So this was a very important decision that Iran made, that it was going to use its nuclear program as leverage to get the United States to lift sanctions on Iran. And it entered into a 2-year negotiation with the US, which ended up in JCPOA. And Iran basically implemented what it had agreed to in the deal of cashiering in large parts of its nuclear program. But then President Trump came in, basically took everything that Iran had given up, and then walked away from the deal. So Iran felt cheated, that it had been double-crossed, and this actually confirmed all the suspicions that the Iranian leadership had about the United States, that you can't trust it, you can't work with it, it means ill to Iran. And so I personally believe that JCPOA would have been the best opportunity, not just to control Iran's nuclear program, but actually begin a process of changing the dynamics of US-Iran relations in a new direction. Instead, President Trump's departure from JCPOA only further entrenched the existing animus that existed between the two.
We have about a final minute here. Can you tell us about the importance of the protests in 2022 and 2023?
They were very important because it showed not only the outside, but also Iranians that there's now a serious gulf between the Islamic Republic and its population. Not only on bread and butter issues or whether the population is supportive of Iran's national security policy and resistance to the US, but also that there is now an ideological gap, that increasing number of Iranians have moved past Iran's, the Islamic Republic's ideology. Particularly the younger generation not only don't want to wear hijab or be forced to follow a particular dress code, but are eager in integrating with the rest of the world. They don't want isolation. And so the scope of the protest, the language of the protest, what the young people were saying, essentially created a situation as if we could say about the Islamic Republic, that the emperor has no clothes. That it embraced a strategy of resistance, which is its grand strategy, whose vision goes back to the 1980s when the population was ideologically very close to the regime and was willing to sacrifice for the regime's policies. In 2023, it became clear that the regime's policies haven't changed, but the people have changed. So that, I think, is the most important significance. It's not really about hijab. It's really about the fact that the Islamic Republic no longer has popular support for the foreign policy and other policies that it's pursuing.
That has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. Professor Nasr, can you tell us a little bit more about your career path? How did you end up at Johns Hopkins?
So I went to, got my PhD in the United States at MIT in comparative politics. I taught at universities in California for a number of years. And then I moved to the East Coast to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And it was at that point in time that I was recruited to go work at the State Department with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke during the Obama administration on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And when I came out, there was an opportunity to join Johns Hopkins University as the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies. So I was the Dean of that school for 7 years. And then I stepped down as being Dean and joined the faculty where I am still situated.
Obviously, the book is a major achievement, but can you tell us more about another accomplishment that you're proud of?
Well, I mean, I've had other books. Some of them also proved timely. I wrote a book on sectarianism in the Middle East right at the time of the Iraq War, the Shia revival, which basically, for the first time, raised the issue that the major impact of America's invasion of Iraq is not promotion of democracy, etc., is that it's actually opened a major fissure in the Middle East between the Shiites and the Sunnis, which we witnessed then. And then I have also written on other aspects in the region, on the political economy of the region, on the rise of the middle class in the region. But I mean, largely, aside from personal achievements, I think the most important thing academics like myself can do is to contribute to the public debate, try to shed light on important questions that policymakers are grappling with.
Are you allowed to tell us what you're working on next? Do you have another book project in mind?
I have ideas in mind. I haven't started a book project because I'm still, if you would, within the fog of this existing book. Still, the overhang is there. And it's also a topic that hasn't finished. As we're talking, this is still unfolding. But I'm actually, and also we're in a period in the world where everything else is also changing at the same time. So I am trying to look at particularly what does all of this mean for the Middle East as a whole. What shape would the region's order take following the period that we're in right now?
That has been our questions for Books in 5. Professor Vali Nasr, thank you so much for joining us. You're active on social media, right? Where can our viewers and listeners find you?
So you can find me at on X at Vali_Nasr. I'm also on Instagram with the same hashtag, on Blue Sky, as well as on Thread and LinkedIn as well.
Again, the title of the book is Iran's Grand Strategy. It is an excellent book about a timely topic. If you're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from your local library. Again, Professor Vali Nasr, thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5.
Thank you very much for having me.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sudan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.